In the spring of 1945, the war in Europe was entering its final weeks. The German army that had conquered most of a continent 4 years earlier was now a broken institution, fighting in fragments and pockets, sustained less by strategic coherence than by the particular combination of ideological commitment, fear of what surrender meant, and the momentum of an organization that had been built to fight and that did not know how to stop. Patton's Third Army was moving east through Germany at the pace that had characterized its operations since the breakout in France. The cities and towns that lay in its path were falling in sequence, some after brief resistance, some after none, and the soldiers of the Third Army had developed a kind of operational rhythm that absorbed the taking of German cities as a routine function of the advance, rather than as the exceptional achievement it would have seemed in any previous war. The city of Kronberg sat in the path of that advance in early April 1945. It was not a large city. It was not a strategically critical city in the way that Frankfurt or Nuremberg or Munich were strategically critical. But it sat astride a route that Patton needed, and it had a garrison commander who had decided that the routine of German cities surrendering to the Third Army was not a routine he was going to participate in. General Wilhelm Kessler had been a soldier for 30 years. He had served in the First World War as a young officer and had remained in the military through the chaos of the Weimar Republic and the transformation of the Wehrmacht under National Socialism. He was not an SS officer, and he was not a committed ideologue in the way that the SS commanders Patton had encountered were committed ideologues. He was something more complicated and in some ways more difficult to deal with. A professional soldier who had decided that his professional obligations required him to hold the city he had been assigned to defend, regardless of the strategic reality surrounding him. When the first American units reached the outskirts of Kronberg and the standard surrender demand was delivered, Kessler's response was delivered back through the same channel with a precision that suggested he had prepared it in advance. He said that the city of Kronberg was a German city, defended by German soldiers under his command, and that it would be defended until the last man and the last bullet. He said that, if the Americans wished to take the city, they were welcome to attempt it. He used a phrase that his staff had translated for the American officer receiving the message, a phrase that came back through the chain of command and eventually reached Patton's headquarters as the English equivalent of what Kessler had said, which was, "Come and take it." Patton received the report of Kessler's response at his headquarters, and his reaction, as recorded by his staff, was not anger. It was something closer to professional interest, the response of a man who had spent his career studying soldiers and who recognized in Kessler's refusal the particular quality of a commander who had made a genuine decision rather than a performative one. He said that Kessler was either a very brave man or a very stupid one, and that the next 6 days would determine which. The assault on Kronberg began the following morning. It was urban combat of the kind that the soldiers of the Third Army had encountered before, but that never became routine regardless of how many times it was encountered. The particular brutality of fighting through buildings and streets where every window was a potential firing position and every intersection was a potential kill zone. The German garrison fought with the commitment that Kessler had promised it would fight with, and the Americans took the city block by block at a cost that Patton tracked with the precise attention he gave to all costs incurred by his army. On the third day of the assault, Patton drove to the forward command post of the division conducting the attack. His staff had learned by this point in the campaign that telling Patton he should not go to a particular place for security reasons was an exercise that consumed time without producing results, and so the security detail went with him and did what it could, and Patton went where he needed to go. He spent several hours at the forward command post, reviewing the situation with the division commander, walking sections of the line where the fighting had temporarily subsided, talking to soldiers in the way he always talked to soldiers, with a directness and a specificity that made clear he understood exactly what they were doing and what it was costing them. He asked questions that reflected detailed knowledge of the tactical situation, and he gave no speeches and made no dramatic gestures, and at one point sat with a wounded sergeant who had been stabilized and was waiting for evacuation, and talked with him for 20 minutes about the specific block where the sergeant had been hit and what the sergeant had seen there. When he returned to his headquarters that evening, he was quieter than usual. His aide noted in the records he kept that Patton ate dinner without speaking and then worked at his desk until late in the night, and that the work he was doing was not operational planning, but the letters to families of men killed in the assault on Kronberg that he wrote personally for every soldier in the Third Army who died under his command. The assault continued for 3 more days. On the 6th day, the German resistance collapsed, not all at once, but in the way that resistance collapses when the men sustaining it have reached the end of what they can sustain, unit by unit and position by position, until what remained of the garrison was surrendering in groups and the city was in American hands. Kessler was captured in the basement of what had been his headquarters, a building that had taken direct hits from American artillery and that was standing only in the technical sense that its walls had not yet fallen. He was in uniform, unwounded, and when the American soldiers who found him reported his location up the chain of command, the instruction that came back was that the general was to be held and that Patton wanted to see him. The meeting took place the following morning. Patton arrived at the facility where Kessler was being held with his aide, and without the theatrical preparation that some commanders brought to encounters with captured enemy generals. He had read the file on Kessler that his intelligence staff had assembled, and he had thought about what he wanted to say and what he wanted to understand. Kessler was brought into the room. He was in his uniform, which had been allowed to him as a matter of the military courtesies extended to captured officers. He stood when Patton entered, and he stood with the posture of a man who intended to conduct himself with whatever dignity the situation allowed. Patton looked at him for a moment. Then he told the interpreter to tell Kessler that he wanted to ask him one question before anything else, and that he wanted an honest answer. The question was, why? Not why had Kessler refused to surrender, which was a military question with a military answer that Patton could have constructed himself. But why, at this point in the war, with the strategic situation as clear as it was, with the outcome as certain as it was, had Kessler decided that the defense of Kronberg was worth what it had cost, worth the soldiers who had died defending it, worth the civilians who had died in 6 days of urban combat, worth the city itself, which was damaged in ways that would take years to repair? Kessler was quiet for a moment. Then he gave his answer. He said that he was a soldier and that soldiers defended what they were assigned to defend. He said that the strategic situation was not his responsibility to assess. He said that his responsibility was the city he had been given, and the men under his command, and the orders he had received, and that a soldier who abandoned those responsibilities because the strategic situation made them seem futile was not a soldier, but something else. Something for which the military vocabulary he had spent 30 years building did not have a respectful word. He said that he knew the war was lost. He said that he had known the war was lost for longer than he was comfortable admitting. But he said that knowing the war was lost and surrendering without a fight were not the same thing for a man who had spent his life in the profession he had chosen, and that the Americans who had taken 6 days to take Kronberg understood this better than anyone else in the room. Patton listened to all of it. When the interpreter finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said something that his aide wrote down with the care he gave to statements he recognized as significant. He said that Kessler was right, that a soldier defended what he was assigned to defend. He said that he respected that principle because it was a principle he had built his own career on. He said that the men who had died taking Kronberg had died doing exactly the same thing, defending what they had been assigned to take, and that the symmetry of that was not something he was going to pretend was simple or comfortable. But then he said something else. He said that there was a point at which the principle of defending what you were assigned to defend stopped being a military obligation and became something different, something that required the soldier to ask not just whether he had the orders and the duty, but whether the cause those orders served was worth the cost being paid to serve it. He said that Kessler's army had reached that point. He did not say it with contempt. He said it with the particular flatness of a man stating something he considered factual rather than something he considered an accusation. He said that the war Germany was fighting had not been a war fought for principles that a professional soldier could defend as worthy of the cost being extracted for them, and that a soldier who spent 30 years in the profession Kessler had chosen owed it to that profession to ask that question honestly. He said that he did not know whether Kessler had asked that question. He said that was between Kessler and whatever accounting he made to himself in the hours when he was honest with himself. But he said that the soldiers who had died in Kronberg on both sides deserved to have that question asked by the commanders who had sent them to die there, and that he was asking Kessler to ask it now, not for Patton's satisfaction, but for the sake of the men whose deaths the answer implicated. Kessler did not respond immediately. When he did, he said something that the interpreter translated carefully and that Patton's aide recorded in full. He said that he had asked that question. He said that he had asked it many times over many years, and that the answers he had given himself had not always been the same, and had not always been ones he was proud of. He said that a soldier in a system like the one he had served in did not always have the freedom to make the answers to that question the determinant of his actions, and that this was something he would carry for the rest of his life. He said that he had fought at Kronberg because it was what he knew how to do. He said that he was not certain that was sufficient justification, and that he was not going to claim that it was. He said that he had ordered his men to fight, and they had fought, and they had died, and now he was in a basement in an American facility, and the war was over for him, and what remained was the accounting that Patton had described. Patton was quiet for a long moment. Then he said that Kessler would be treated according to the Geneva Convention, and that he would have access to the legal representation that the post-war process would provide. He said that what happened after that was not in his hands and would be determined by processes that were larger than either of them. Then he said one more thing. He said that the conversation they had just had was the most honest conversation he had had with a German officer since the war began, and that he did not know what that said about the other conversations, or about the war, or about the profession they both belonged to, but that it was true, and he thought it was worth saying. He left. Kessler stood for a moment in the room after he was gone, and then sat down, and the aide who had been present, and who wrote about it later, said that Kessler looked like a man from whom something very heavy had been partially lifted, not removed, not resolved, but shifted slightly, in the way that being truly heard sometimes shifts the weight of things that cannot be undone. The city of Kronberg was rebuilt after the war. The streets where American and German soldiers had fought for 6 days were repaired, and the buildings that had been destroyed were replaced, and the city resumed the ordinary life that cities resume when the extraordinary has passed through them and moved on. Kessler survived the war and the post-war proceedings. He lived until 1971. He wrote a memoir that was published in Germany in 1963, and that was notable among the memoirs of German officers of his generation for the particular honesty with which it addressed the question Patton had asked him to ask himself. The section of the memoir that dealt with Kronberg and with the conversation in the basement was read by military historians as one of the more honest accounts produced by a German officer of the period. He never met Patton again. Patton died in December 1945, before the memoir was written, before the accounting had fully begun, before the profession they had both spent their lives in had worked through what the war had done to the principles it had been built on. But in a basement in a damaged German city in the spring of 1945, 2 professional soldiers had had the most honest conversation available to them about what they had done and why and what it had cost and what it meant. And Patton had asked the question that needed to be asked, and Kessler had given the answer that needed to be given, and the aide who had been present had written it all down, and it had not been forgotten.